Diane, we're talking about environmental history. I always thought environmentalism was something fairly new that we were just now starting to fight about.
It has a history.
It does have a history.
And if we can get over our big feed from yesterday,
okay,
we'll dig in a little bit. It has a big history, and we can't hit everything, but we'll touch some of the bases for it. It is something that has existed for a long, long time. People have been aware of it, and people have tried to do things about damaging the environment. But I don't think they have fully realized that we're just immersed in it, and what happens to it happens to us eventually. But I thought it would be interesting to look at how the word is defined, which means how it's looked at in some ways. Now, environmentalism, in one thing said, or environmental rights, and this starts to take in a bigger field.
Yes, that does.
Than just you and me. It's a broad philosophy, ideology, and social movement. Well, that sets you off on the wrong track, right? It's not a philosophy at all. It's working with something that exists here, and not trying to cause any doctrine, write any doctrine about it. It's trying to understand it and cope with it, and protect it as things stand now. But it, including concerns of non-human elements. So animals, birds, sea creatures, all kinds of things come into it, plus the land itself, trees, the things we eat, the whole bit. And this definition adds, it may be referred to as a movement to control pollution or protect plant and animal diversity. Well, there it gets a little bit better, because trying to
what we are now,
ensure that we aren't just immersed in a toxic soup with nothing to help us out. Another definition of it, which I liked a lot better, was that environmentalism is an attempt to balance relations between humans and the various natural systems on which they depend in such a way that all the components are accorded a proper degree of sustainability. In other words, that we're not only balanced, but it has to be able to last, to keep repeating itself. One more just calls it a social movement, but the good part of this one is it seeks to influence the political process by various ways, lobbying, education, and so on, to protect the natural resources. And all of this shows that we should have this concern, but we actually perhaps don't.
We seem to feel that, well, it's always going to be there.
Yes.
And we don't realize how fragile some of it is.
Yeah. I think, as we'll see in some of the later points I want to touch, it's the desire for, well, greed in some instances, but more than just making a living and sustaining yourself. It's out there to game the system.
Right.
Regardless of what it does to the system or to other people, or
yeah.
animals, or the future in it. I'm going to jump a little bit to the end. The conclusion of this is not exactly pessimistic, but it doesn't look all that good. Now, Stephen Hawking, for those who might not be familiar with him, Stephen Hawking is a very famous English scientist, primarily a physicist, and he had some gross physical problems.
Yes.
Which he surmounted thanks to some technology and willpower. But he has, earlier, well, this very year, he is predicting that certainly within 1,000 years, but maybe any time soon, there's going to be a virtually inevitable global cataclysm of some sort, and that doesn't just mean maybe running into an asteroid. Right. But he said he is backing the search for another habitable planet. He thinks we ought to be doing that. And he says we must continue to go into space. I don't think we will survive another 1,000 years without escaping beyond our fragile planet. We face threats to our survival from nuclear war, there's a big one, catastrophic global warming, which many people still don't even believe in,
Still don't believe.
despite the proof, and genetically engineered viruses. And these are the things that we try to dream up to solve illnesses and then other things that are going to get in there. The number is likely to increase, the number of these factors in the future, with the development of new technologies and new ways things can go wrong.
Right.
So, with this picture as a background, let's take a brief look at how long the human race has been aware that things can go wrong. The earliest historical reference I've found of this was 2700 BC.
2700 BC.
BC, 2,700 years. It's
so over 4,000 years ago.
Yeah, it's in the third millennium BC. So if you round numbers, it's say 5,000 years ago. There was a king in Mesopotamia, which is where a lot of the early civilization took place. His name was Gilgamesh. And there's a famous epic, you may have had it, some of our audience may have had that in school, you know, along with a quick taste of Beowulf and some other ancient things. But it's a long epic, a lot of adventures, this and that. But one of the things, Gilgamesh and some underling are setting off to cut down the cedars of Lebanon. And I haven't looked at this in years, so I don't remember exactly the context, but I think it was one of those things like the labors of Hercules, you know, where you set these impossible tasks to do it, but they're off to do it. And it indicates here that, let's see, Humbaba, yeah. If they do that, they better look out, because they will incur the wrath of the forest god, Humbaba. And what Humbaba will do is, if they take away the trees, is make the land barren. And we have seen that in our own day.
Many times.
You cut down the trees, the topsoil is washed away, and the land is barren. Well, we next can take a peek. The next good one I found was in the year 1750 BC, and this was Hammurabi. This was another name we might even have heard in grammar school. Famous giver of laws. And Hammurabi established a law here against unauthorized tree felling. And he was presumably the one that was going to authorize it, or the king anyway, whose word was law. It was no debating. You will not cut down trees. If you do, we will cut you down, you know, that kind of thing. Look at the area today. Now, this area and the Gilgamesh area are both where Iraq is now, where the Tigris and Euphrates come down, you know, that area. And look at it now, even before these latest wars. It's a desert. And you move over and on into Syria, it's desert, and there are places then where it's better. But as you look back down the Mediterranean coast and you head around toward Egypt, where once the cedars of Lebanon were all over everywhere, huge trees and green things, the Dead Sea, remember that? And that, too, was once fertile land. But now it's utterly dead and barren. Make of that what you will. But it shows that time can affect changes, and that cutting down of trees and doing other things, of course, can have very serious effects on people. Now, today even, earlier this month, toward the beginning of November, or the middle, we had the Daesh people, the ISIL, you know, these caliphate people, as they retreat from Mosul, they're igniting a lot of the oil fields.
Oh, boy.
And they've done that before, some years back. It produces a very, very nasty type of cloud, particulate matter. It poisons people. It poisons the ground, even when the fires stop, which takes a long time, feeding, you know, on underground sources. They're poisoning the people and the land they live on. So what do you make of that? Well, people knew that those areas shouldn't be deforested a long time ago, and yet they've been deforested. I guess more slowly than they might, because there were fewer people in olden times, and they had fewer good weapons, tools, technological devices, so it took them longer. But they were working away at it. Now, one more in the BC, our old friend Plato. Plato, in the dialogues, talked about this very matter of cutting down all the trees. He said, look what has happened. He said, it has already happened here. Look at Athens, you know, the Athenian state. No trees anymore. The land is not as productive, as fertile as it used to be. And he said, oh yeah, he mentioned specifically the topsoil being washed away. And again, look at Greece today. Greece is not an absolute total desert, but all the mountains where there were forests on the mountains, they're gone. And that means the mountains are reduced to these, you know, jagged, they're beautiful. Greece is a beautiful country.
They're jagged, rocky mountains. Yeah.
But there's not enough soil to do much with. So in other words, that was a warning, too, that was not heeded, unfortunately. Now, when we proceed on to this side, I'm not saying BC and AD, I don't mean to be offending anybody if I am, but that's just a very convenient means of dividing the time period, since we have this complicated calculation to make. But in the early centuries now, the Arabs played an important role. We had them talking about not deforesting, and we had in their medical system, they dealt not only with health, but they also dealt with these causes of bad things. Air pollution, water pollution were discussed. And another one, mishandling of solid waste. And here's one that any community today is going to be one of their priorities, to do a good job on that. But if you welch on that, you start running into trouble. And if you start polluting the areas where you're depositing things, if you're not working with it right, again, you're really sinking yourself.
Right.
Now, I think my next important landmark here was in England, and this is the earliest reference I could find to this burning of coal, which, you know, for fuel and also in people's homes. To heat with it. So the King Edward I, in 1272, banned the use of burning coal in London.
Really?
And the smoke, the results were recognized as toxic, and even then there were enough people in London that this was beginning to be a problem with everybody
so what did they turn to instead of coal?
Well, they don't, that you don't find anywhere. Now, whether they were supposed, that's a good question. They were supposed to stop using coal to do it, but they were supposed to apparently either make their own disposition of it or just not use as much. I'd like to know the answer to myself, but I have a feeling it didn't have much effect.
Well, I would imagine, because coal was about the only, coal or peat was the only fuel they had.
Well, they could have, I suppose they could have gone over, perhaps used charcoal, but making that would...
Well, that takes wood,
pollute,
the trees.
Just a bad thing. There was also a theory that Minoan Crete was very important in the BC, second millennium BC, and later on, when the Copper Age began. You know, they had the Stone Age and you had the Iron Age, and then I guess in the third millennium, the copper and bronze, the Bronze Age came on, and that was the big thing. And that to make it, you had to smelt, and they figured out how to smelt, but it took hot heat.
Right.
And there started to go the forests. And according to this theory, all around the Mediterranean, you can find evidence of it now. In Spain and in Turkey and all over the place. Of course, Greece was part of that too. But you saw that now. If you look at today, there's still some problem with it in London. It's still smoggy and not too good. And it's not all from that volcano in Iceland either.
Right.
But of course, a lot of progress has been made.
Yeah.
But the problem was recognized very early. However, now we fast forward again to another important point here. In the 1700s, it's when they're just the beginnings of industrialization. And you had writers like Oliver Goldsmith. He's another one that we were touched upon in our early school years. And he wrote a very famous, well, like a novel or a story, but in quatrains, in verse. And this was called The Deserted Village. And we had to memorize parts of it. The only one I remember is, ill fares the land, to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and we decay. And sure enough, this was the beginning. Today, for instance, the number of people that can calculate in their head, or the number of people that can tie, the children that can tie a bow, or even tell time without having it done for them electronically. That's a rather striking example, but it shows you that people started to decay when production of things, they became automata. We're just making things, moving a widget or moving a machine. Machines were taking over.
And now they want robots to take over.
And robots, they want even robots to drive cars.
That's right.
It's rather difficult. But Stephen Hawking recognized this too, and he said technology is not a boon for the human race. No. On the contrary. Remind you of some old saying about the invention of light, and that was not good either, because that meant people could sit up all night if they wanted to. They could alter the rhythms of themselves and the planet and so on. So if you pursue this to the bitter end, you can get quite a...
Right.
But I think the overall point is rather clear. But you had the whole literary movement and painting, art movement that developed after the end of the 1770s and into the 80s was called the Romantic literary movement. It didn't mean all love and kisses, but it meant adventure and lively things. There was a return to the past and back to innocence and all that. But there, again, there were warnings that what was maybe shaping up, and they really weren't taken seriously. And of course, the population is increasing. I've forgotten those statistics, but it just didn't increase exponentially, but large exponentially. So of course, all of them were doing these things. We had more smoke pollution, and now today, of course, we have the same. Yes, I wanted to mention another effect here. There's global dimming. We have not only global warming, but I heard a PBS special one time, several years ago. The only place I ever saw it referred to or heard anything about it, and it turns out to be true. There's a phenomenon going on called global dimming. On the one hand, you have warming, which means that a lot of this radiation that comes into the Earth can't get out, and you get the greenhouse effect. Global dimming takes the particulate matter in the atmosphere to task and shows that it is blocking a certain amount of the necessary incoming sun rays. And this was discovered. This is not just somebody's idea, but not all that long ago, probably 20, 30, 40 years ago, scientists that were investigating problem with frogs, they came across, of course, water pollution, things like that were making them have 3 eyes, and funny things happening. But they found that frogs, other little animals, and plants were falling off. Some were going extinct. And they had an idea. Maybe it had something to do with not enough sunlight getting in, but why isn't it? I mean, don't we have global warming after all? And then came the 11th of September, 2001. And for 3 solid days, there was no air traffic over the United States, not a bit. And in those 3 days, those paltry 3 days, the Earth started to heal itself. The radiation became greater again. These things kind of perked up. They were, of course, testing them like mad when they saw what was going on. And then, of course, back came the air traffic, redoubled, and back it went.
I remember reading something about that a number of years ago, about certain areas that had more cloud cover that were causing this kind of thing, and it was all centered around many of these air hubs where the the various airlines had their hubs.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting, yeah. Well, they did all kinds of experimenting with it, the Indian Ocean and so on, and they discovered that it's absolutely real. And then they did their calculations, and they figured if it weren't for that, global warming would have been 25% greater or faster or whatever the comparison was. So that is actually slowing it down. I suppose we shouldn't discourage it, for that reason. But it's kind of scary that people don't realize, even some scientists, I guess, what effect it has if you do something to one part of it.
Right. It's a checks and balances type of
thing. Things are going,
it's
going to ripple, yeah, they're going to be ripple effects. Well, let's see, I better skip. I don't want to go too long. I want to give a case study, so don't let me get to
How long do you need for that?
Last minute. Well, probably 5 minutes anyway, maybe a little more. In the well, I don't know, I could bring the case study in now, maybe.
Okay.
Maybe I should do that.
Go ahead.
Because in 1853, something occurred. A bunch of gold miners, remember 1849 was the gold rush in California. A group of gold miners, and apparently ones that didn't succeed too well, were roaming around, settling out there. And they were hunting, and they came across this gorgeous grove of huge trees. And this was not the famous ones down on the coast. This was in Calaveras County, and I've been there. And there are these fantastic trees, 300 feet tall, almost as tall, well, 3/5 as tall as the Washington Monument anyway, and huge, as big around as a dance floor. And in that year, a bunch of these people discovered it. The Indians had known about it for hundreds of years, of course. But these folks discovered it, and their first thought was, how much can we make of this? And it wasn't just, well, maybe we can put up a hotel and get some people to come here. Traveling was not the easiest in those days. But they decided they were going to cut them down. We go clear back to 2700 BC, and Gilgamesh going to cut down the cedars of Lebanon. Well, they actually succeeded in cutting down one of these trees. It took 3 weeks, and I don't know how many people were involved with their little axes. It took 3 weeks, and once they had it on the ground, people, local newspaper zeroed in on some of this. And they realized, of course, that if they cut down that whole grove, not only would you be losing something awesome, and beautiful, but you would again be ruining the land. You'd be taking away what it had there.
Someone at least recognized it.
Yes. Now, I have a couple of pictures. I thought we would spice this up a little bit.
Okay.
Could we have pictures, please? The first one will be fine. This is a painting. And you see there on the left, that huge thing lying on the ground represents the felled tree. You don't have any people there for comparison. It's not too good. But you see lovely wooded area, beautiful wooded area,
yes.
Sun filtering through the tree. Now, if we go to the second picture, we will see in the 1860s, this was 1853, as I say, that this happened. Here's in the 1860s sometimes, you have to look hard. If you look hard, you can see two people in the foreground.
Right.
On the very lower border of that screen, visiting. And so you see the immense size. In the distance, you see where it was cut through. Now, what they did, first of all, was strip off all the bark, which was cruel anyway. It would have killed the tree, regardless of what else they did. But they stripped off the bark. They reassembled it, charged people admission to come and see it. They sent it down to the coast, San Francisco, I suppose, charged people to see it. It next turns up in New York City, where people, again, are charged to come and see this. And some bright person, P.T. Barnum or somebody, ships it across the Atlantic, and it's the rage of London for a couple of weeks. It runs in London. And they say, wow. Well, now, meanwhile, of course, the tree is dying. Go on to the next picture, please. And here is the stump. They subsequently knocked down another one while this was going on, and that was the end of it. But this is a stump, and I've actually been there and walked on that The stump is beautiful. Of course, they polished it off or whatever, because you see all these rings. The tree is over 1,200 years old. And they had tea dances. They put up a hotel, and they had tea dances where people could come up and dance on this. Really went at it. The next picture, and here they are like insects clambering all over the whole thing. This was sometime fairly on in the process too. It began to deteriorate after a while, but the immenseness, I guess, remained. It was not there lying in wait when I was there a few years ago. There was no evidence of it, just these beautiful trees. The only bad thing we saw was where they had cut through one of them for the road, a 2-lane road to go through, with lots of space, you know, where the roots above ground part are like this, and the tree went through in the middle, so they had violated that. But one more picture, I think we just have one more. And that one, the puzzle is find the person. And if you will look right near the bottom, you'll see a little teeny stick figure.
Yes.
And that is I. I am in there.
Oh, that's you.
That's, yeah, there it is. And you could sort of lie on those roots and pet them and all that. They're tough, but they're beautiful. There's redwood color. I guess they're the same kind of tree as the redwoods. But imagine people walking into this grove and their first thought is, let's cut these down. It's hard to follow along with that mentality. A lot of it's still there. I heard only the other day that there's been an application for opening gold mine operations in Yosemite. Can you imagine what that would do to the... Wow. It's bad enough they have so many tourists now, they're going to have to try to limit it more some way, because it's just the waste alone, you know. What do you do with it? But you fall all over people. It wasn't deserted when we were there, but you could walk around, you know. And people, the smart alecks that get in there and put some food out and then get in the car and lock yourself in the car and watch the bear come. And then, of course, the bear came a couple of times and overturned the car.
Sure.
You know, but people just don't learn from those things. But such was the state of things in the 1860s. Now, also in the 1860s, early 1860s, Lincoln was president. Henry David Thoreau was up there living on that pond in Massachusetts and lobbying for being kind to nature. Photography was just coming into its own, and there were a lot of beautiful pictures taken in Yellowstone. And they presented to Lincoln and said, please, Mr. President, can you not order that nothing be done to these trees? You know, already done up in, done in the big trees, Calaveras County. And Lincoln said, oh, done. He agreed with it. And Thoreau, of course, they kept on with that. And not too long later, 1870-something, I think, they actually founded the National Park series. This one is a California state park, the Calaveras. But the ball began to roll anyway, and you heard a lot more agitating for taking care of the environment. And of course, industry polluting like mad. And then came that fool idea of the cap and trade. Instead of just saying, no, you will cut down, they said, well, you can do it all you want if you get your neighbor not to do it, you know. They kept trying there. But the, now let's see. The Sierra Club, yeah, I was going to mention that. That was founded in 1892. So that was at least something going forward. But you know, another prime example of how they don't heed these things is Flint, Michigan. This whole thing, which is still fresh in our mind, and these people are still being settled with. The settlements are still being made, and they're still looking for those that they know were there who haven't applied. Do they die? You know, or what? And what about these poor children? You know, either dead or stunted for life. So if there's been plenty of publicity, there just is not the willpower. It's just, I'm going to make my pile, and then you can do it. And it gets out of hand. Well, the whole National Park Service was started by Woodrow Wilson then in 1916. You had a lot of chemical waste coming up, and of course technology was causing different methods.
Well, it's sort of like the nuclear
production.
power, you know. Certainly it's advantageous for heating and this type of thing. It has its dark side with the explosives, but it also, what do you do with the nuclear waste? So, you know, you have to weigh, are the advantages worth the disadvantages?
Yeah.
And you can go back to the Bible, and you know, God said, "Let the land lay fertile." 1 year out of, you know, after 7 years, don't use it. And you know, they didn't do it, and the land suffered.
No, that's not.
And of course, now we have crop rotation and this type of thing, which seems to help.
The Nazi German government, oddly enough, was the best protector of environment that's come along for a long time. They had all kinds of laws passed and enforced them, you can believe, about hunting and about diddling with anything in the natural resources, animals, without express permission, and of course the permission was really not granted. You did not have anybody looking at the Earth as a whole system either. You had plenty of scientific research on that subject, and mathematics, you know, looking at game theory and things, how you control things. But in 1987, NASA did a study, or ordered a study, and Sally Ride was put in charge of it. She was, you know, not only one of the NASA pilots, but a physicist. In fact, she wound up, I think, she's maybe wound up as a professor of physics at a university. But she was also one of the first people in space. And this commission did its work, and the committee did its work. And at the end, they came up with 4 recommendations about what the future of NASA should be. That was the idea here, to sort of take stock now that we've gotten into space and see what next. And she strongly espoused the first one. And the first one was, she called it Mission Planet Earth. And it was to look at the Earth as a whole system. And she said, the Earth is a single system in recognition of our responsibility to our own planet. And she said, when you get out there, I remember her saying that at the time in interviews, there's nothing like getting out there where you're not on it. You're not there. You're away from not just home base, you know, but you're not there. And then we long to go back to it, and what if it's not there? But now, in recognition of our responsibility to our own planet, regulation, well, let's see. Yeah, I guess that was the end of that quote from her. I had a little more to that. But they, as you can see, they did not do that. I looked in vain for a study, you know, of the total picture of Earth. Now, of course, I didn't research every single thing on the planet, but you would think that something like that would be readily findable. And I didn't find a thing that had been done. So, and of course, clearly, if she went off to teach physics in a university, they were not keeping on with this plan, because I'm sure she would have had a role in it.
She was the one who was pushing it.
At the same time, yeah.
Okay, I think we're down to about our last minute. So
now, the one thing I found that really went whole hog for, remember that everything is one continuum. We and this thing we're in, we're all one.
We're enmeshed together.
Anything you do with one to one is going to happen to the other. Now, the Earth has remarkable recuperative possibilities, but it's just being overdone.
Right.
But the only religion I found that went for that all the way was some of the North American Indian things, which are not even religions.
Right, but they really had a respect for the Earth.
They did. And this one thing I read about it, I pointed out that that they're myths and legends. They don't have the equivalent of a Bible.
Right.
And they're not do this and don't do that, and and if you don't do this, you won't get to heaven, you know, whatever. They don't have any of those those rules, and that probably is one of the things responsible for all the different religions and how they get at each other's trouble. But here, the myths themselves are intended and used as teaching stories that guide individual behavior in ways that support the individual and the community, not as metaphysical speculation.
Right.
And I think we could all, our religions too, these religions seem to lack punishment for anything, don't inflict eternal torture. But in these cultures, a life out of balance with this spirit of all, and with the earth, and with the community that you're in, beginning, right now with you and me, and going on up with the community, getting out of balance with all of this is its own punishment.
Exactly.
And that's what I think Stephen Hawking is sort of getting at. That's our punishment if we do this.
Right.
And of course, it's a mass thing. You and I, if we go out and burn something bad, it probably isn't going to reflect on us.
Okay, we need to wind it up. And I think probably our lesson from this is be aware of what you're doing, that it has an effect on everything around you.
Mm-hmm. And respect the earth. It just somehow, and think about doing anything we can to recognize what's happening to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see what kind of announcements we have here. For our feature programming today at 2 and at 8, we're going to have the Steve Guback travel.